I will explain about bind off at the end of knitting. There are so many types of bind off, but this time we will start with the most basic method called standard bind off and introduce 3 advanced methods. Instead of memorizing each one separately, compare the structures and systematically understand them. First, let's talk about standard bind off. The basis of standard bind off is the movement of covering stitch. Of the 2 stitches lined up, put the right stitch on the left. We will continue to bind off the stitch by repeating this. Since this operation is performed on the 2 stitches hanging on the right needle, first knit the 2 stitches so that the right needle has 2 loops and then cover it. After that, 1 stitch is knitted and covered, and 1 stitch is knitted and covered. Although it is expressed as covering, it is sensuously closer to pulling out the left stitch from the right stitch as an actual operation. Insert a needle into the right stitch to fix the loop, and pull out the left stitch from it. If you want to bind off knit stitch, make knit stitch and cover it, but if you want to bind off purl stitch, make purl stitch and cover it. The basic flow is the same for knit and purl. There is one important point here. I introduced the method of knitting and covering to make the structure, but there is actually another method. The structure that can be achieved is the same even if the loop of the right needle is returned to the left needle and knitted together. This works very well when bind off purl. However, be careful when binding off knit. If you normally try to knit 2 stitches together, the left stitch will be on top. To make the right stitch up, first put the needle in the right stitch purl-wise, then put the needle in the left stitch knit-wise. Then knit 2 stitches together. This will bring the right stitch to the top, creating the same structure as the standard bind off. Keep in mind that knitting and covering and returning and knitting together are structurally the same. Next, I will explain Icelandic bind off. This is a very similar operation to the previous movement of returning and knitting together. Return the stitch on the right needle, insert the needle purl-wise, and then insert the needle knit-wise. It's the same up to this point. Now pull the left stitch from the right stitch. And we will knit. Repeat this for Icelandic bind off. Compared to the structure of standard bind off, the position to cover the right stitch is different. In standard bind off, the right stitch is overlaid on the left stitch, and in Icelandic bind off, it is overlaid on the stitch below the left stitch. In standard bind off, it was in the form of knitting and then covering, but in Icelandic bind off, it can be said that it is in the form of covering and then knitting. It's a slight difference in structure, but it has an interesting effect on the appearance. Next, I will explain decrease bind off. The stitch on the right needle is returned to the left needle, and the needle is inserted into the 2 stitches purlwise, and knit together. If you knit a twist stitch instead of knit stitch and cover it with standard bind off, the structure will be the same. The twisted stitches increase the elasticity slightly. This does not mean that the knitted fabric will stretch easily, but that the twisting of the stitch will increase the force to return to its original shape, that is, the force to shrink. Finally, I will explain about elastic bind off. This is similar to decrease bind off, but we knit one more stitch before returning the 1 stitch on the right needle. Then, return the 2 stitch on the right needle to the left needle. When you insert the needle so that it returns to the left needle, the right needle is already in the state of purlwise, so knit 2 stitches together. Knit 1 stitch, return 2 stitches, and knit 2 stitches together. Repeat this procedure. In standard bind off, if you put it back before covering the stitch, knit the twisted stitch and cover it, the structure will be the same. The difference from decrease bind off is that the twisted stitches are not directly connected. Elastic bind off allows for greater stretch due to the extra thread. Let's review how to bind off so far. In standard bind off, the right stitch of the 2 stitches on the right needle is placed on the left stitch. It is an operation of knitting and covering. Let's look at other bind off based on this knitting and covering movement. Icelandic bind off is a movement of covering and then knitting. Decrease bind off is a movement of knitting a twisted stitch and covering. Elastic bind off is a movement of knitting a stitch, knitting a twisted stitch, and covering it. There are different ways to move the needle that can make the same structure. In standard bind off, if you return the stitch on the right needle, insert the needle purlwise, then insert the needle knitwise and knit 2 stitches together. The structure will be the same as when knitting and covering. Let's look at other methods based on this movement of returning and knitting together. In Icelandic bind off, the needle is inserted in the same way as standard bind off, but instead of knitting together, the left stitch is taken out from the right stitch and knit. In decrease bind off, return 1 stitch on the right needle, put needles in 2 stitches purlwise, and knit 2 stitches together. In elastic bind off, return 2 stitches on the right needle, put needles in 2 stitches purlwise, and knit 2 stitches together. The resulting structure is the same regardless of whether the movement is knit and cover or return and knit together. However, depending on the ease of operation, there may be a difference that it is loose and tight. The above is an explanation of the 4 types of bind off methods. If you take a bird's eye view in this way, you can see that there are structural similarities. Standard bind off is the basis, and changes are made by changing the way the needle is inserted and adding stitch. The principle of twisting the stitches to increase the contraction force and adding extra thread to add room for stretching is also helpful in understanding other ways of bind off, so remember when in trouble. Thank you for your viewing.